Okay, welcome to this video on cutting lists. It's a bit of a tricky video because it's kind of been covered before in the finance management plan, but I'm going into a significantly more detail around specifically the cutting list. I'm going to show you and talk about the process of completing a cutting list, but I'm also going to take you all the way through to ordering. But to get there, we need to actually understand a little bit about linear meters, a little bit about nominal dimensions, and we also need to understand that there is a direct relationship between our working drawings, our cutting list, and our finance plan. So starting off, we're looking at the fundamentals of timber dimensions. There are three key dimensions on any piece of timber that we've got in the workshop, and that's the thickness, the width, and the length. When we buy our timber from the shop, we buy it based on the cross-sectional size, so the thickness and the width. So for example, you'll quite often hear me say, can you go to the storeroom and can you get me a piece of 42 by 19? When I say that, what I'm saying is 42 wide by 19 millimeters thick. Then when you say, sir, how big should it be? That's when I give you the length and I'll say, oh, about 2 meters. And then that gives you the length. And see how the cross-sectional dimensions are in millimeters, but the lengths we usually talk about in meters. And that's fairly standard across the timber industry. Now, the other thing to understand is that when timber is initially cut off the tree through to when we get it in the workshop, there's a fair bit of processing that happens. There's this thing called nominal sizing. Now, if you have a look at the picture on the right, we would call this nominally sized timber, but we can also refer to it as rough sawn. What happens is the tree gets cut down, you've got a whole log, and then it goes through those giant circular saws and it gets cut into what we call nominal sizes. Now, all these nominal sizes are kind of based on old school American imperial measurements, so they're in inches. So if you've heard of people say, oh, I want a piece of 2 by 4 or 1 by 2, they're talking 2 by 4 inches, so 2 inches wide, 4 inches thick, sort of thing. So that's what they're talking about. And these are nominal sizes. If you got a piece of 2 by 4 from Bunnings right now, what you'd find is actually smaller than 2 by 4. And that's because you're not picking up rough sawn, you're picking up the finished dressed timber. Now, when we dress timber, that's when you get that really nice, clean, crisp surface, kind of like what we experience here in the workshops. And these are planed on the thickness and planed on the width. And so it reduces the sizes. Now, my next screen is going to take you through the process of what actually happens to the timber during the nominal through to dressed state. And there are three main states we talk about. The first is rough sawn, like we said. That's the nominal size. That's the largest of the dimensions. This is got a furry finish on it, splintery looking, looks as raw as possible to what you'd expect if you cut a tree down. Then the timber is put through a planer and a thicknesser, so a jointer planer and a thicknesser, to get one straight edge and one straight side. Now, this timber is referred to as D1S1E, dressed one side and one edge, hence D1S1E, dressed one side, dressed one edge. This costs a little bit more to buy than rough sawn because someone or a machine has run to dress it, to actually cut off those raw surfaces and plane them down. So if you look at the rough sawn image and it's got the blue dotted line, that's what the D1S1 gets cut down to. So it cuts one side and one edge off. Then the most expensive and the best quality of them all is the dressed timber, and that's on the right-hand side. It's the most expensive, it's the smallest, because another two sides have been cut off. You could call this D2S2E, but you don't. You just call it dressed all round, DAR. And in this sense, if you look at the D1S1E and it's got the little red dotted lines on it now, it gets smaller again. It cuts the other two edges off. And so dressed timber is always smaller than nominal timber. And it's really important that you're aware of this language when you're buying your timber from the shop. Quite often you'll get a really good deal. You're like, wow, that was so cheap. But you'll get nominal sizing instead of dress sizing, and then you have to machine it yourself. Now, without a jointer planer at the school, it's impossible for us to really accurately machine down your timber to a really high quality level. You're much better off spending the extra couple of dollars and buying dressed timber. Now, when we're thinking about dressed timber, there are some pretty common sizes, common thicknesses and common widths. And we've got them up on the screen there. The one that we use most often in the workshop is 19 millimeter thick. However, it wouldn't be rare to see a little bit of 12 millimeter in the workshop as well. And then quite often when we're talking about major works for year 11 or 12 students, they're quite often working with 25 or 32 millimeter thick timber. The thicker the timber, obviously the more expensive it is because you've actually got more wood per meter. Likewise, the widths, as the width goes up, you're paying a higher cost. So some pretty common ones that we stock in the workshop are 42 millimeters wide, 70, 90, and 140. But there are a whole range of sizes larger than this as well, up to the 300s and higher, that would be considered common widths. But the main ones that we deal with are those on the screen. Now, why am I telling you about common thicknesses and common widths? Well, that's because when we're actually preparing our cutting list, we need to think about what is the width and what is the thickness that we are going to be using and how we're going to order it from the shop. Sometimes we join timber together to get the width we need. Sometimes we buy it at the right width. Sometimes we need to cut it smaller than what we buy to get the width we need. Now, if we're looking at the cutting list, you can see the cutting list forms the left-hand side of the finance aspect of the timber. So the right-hand side of the table that's not highlighted is where we do the costing. The left-hand side is really just the cutting list component. It's where we get what are the parts, what are the sizes, and what are the materials. Real basic details. And we get these directly from our project drawings. I would always start with an exploded isometric drawing. I get my project, I draw it in SketchUp, each piece is an individual component, and then I put it here in exploded view, pull each piece apart slightly, and then I can count all of the individual pieces on the screen. The benefit of doing it like this is it means that I don't miss anything. I can see each individual component, and it also proves that I've got all of my components created in SketchUp, and that's an extra skill for me when it comes to the drawing aspect of the project. So what I do is I look at the project, I explode it, I make sure that each piece appears on the cutting list, and if there are pieces that are similar, then rather than put them on the cutting list twice, I put them on once and increase the quantity. So my example here is, if I look at this project, there's two sides. I've got a left-hand side and a right-hand side. I've also got two rails at the top, and I've got two shelves. These are all similar sized pieces. So when I'm ordering, I don't order one shelf and then another shelf. I actually order two of the same piece. Okay, so there it is. Sorry for skipping the slides there. Now have a look at the cutting list. I get each of the parts, I give them a number, okay, part IDs. I give them a description, so I describe what part they are from the drawings. I select the material that I'm planning to use, and then I put in the quantities. So I have two rails, two sides, 4 door frames, 4 short door frames, 2 door inserts, 2 drawer sides, 2 drawer backs, 1 false front, and 1 cabinet. So there's my quantities, my pieces, and the materials sorted. Once I've got those in, then I go back in and put in the lengths, the widths, and the thicknesses. To get those details, I go to the orthogonal drawings. Now, when I do drawings, I have an orthogonal drawing for each individual piece in my project. Front, top, side view, dimensioned. And then what I can do is I can actually read off the screen what the width is, what the thickness is, and what the length is. Now, the cutting list, the finance plan, and the project drawings are super related because it's all based on the dimensions you're dealing with. When I'm doing my drawings, I'm thinking about these common thicknesses and common widths to make sure that I'm using timber that's actually available for us to purchase and for us to use in the workshop without too much wastage. That makes it easier when I'm then dimensioning it because I'm using common sizes. And it also means it's easier when I order the timber because I can order exactly what I need instead of having to order random widths and cut them to size. So when I'm doing my drawings, I'm thinking about the width and the thickness. And then when I'm actually preparing my cutting list, I go back to the drawings and hopefully the widths and the thickness are on my common list. And then add the total length in, and I end up with a cutting list that looks like this. I've got my lengths, my widths, and my thicknesses. Now I'm going to draw your attention to the width column. Just run your eyes down and you'll see that there's some pretty common sizes there. 70s, 90s, 42s. These are common dimensions. Down the bottom, I've got 130 and 110 highlighted in red because they're not common. So there's going to be some sort of process that I'm going to need to follow to get that width of timber. I can either join two bits together and cut them shorter, or, cut them smaller along the width, or I can order a larger piece and cut it along the width as well. Okay, so there's two different ways that I can get specific sizes. The goal is always to reduce the amount of wastage. So I wouldn't just go and order a 190 piece of timber and trim it down to 110 because then I'm throwing out 80 millimeters of width, and that's a bit of wastage. So we try to avoid wastage whenever we can. Once I've got this aspect of my cutting list sorted, then I'm really ready to move on to the financial aspect. Now, I'm not going to go into the details about how we do this. You can go back to the finance video and watch that. But that's once you've got the left side of the table, then you can move to the right side. Instead, I'm going to go back to my cutting list. I'm now going to show you the process that I follow to order my timber. The first thing that I've done here is I've highlighted the width and thicknesses that are similar. So you can see in blue, I've highlighted all of the 90 by 19s. In red, I've highlighted the 70 by 19s. And in yellow, I've highlighted the 42 by 19s. Because these are similar, when I'm doing my calculations for my ordering, I actually consider these to be one piece. So I need to do a little bit of math to add them all together. Okay, so I'll show you this process with the 42 by 19. Firstly, I say this is 42 by 19 dimensional lumber. So that's what I'm going to be ordering. And then I need to work out the lengths. This is where I add the length of one piece and I multiply it by the quantity of that piece that are needed. So if I'm looking at A06 at the top there, the long door frame, one of those is 512 millimeters long, but I need 4 of them. So to get the total length needed, I do multiplication. 512 length multiplied by quantity of 4 gives me an answer of 2048 millimeters. I do the same for the next item. Then I can add those together to work out my total. In total, I need 3.3 meters of 42 by 19 millimeter timber. So when you've got your total lengths that you need for each dimension, then you're ready to start thinking about the actual ordering process. And the most important thing that I want to share with you here is really think about what you're ordering and how you're going to get it from the shop to your house. The reason I say that is pretty clear. Have a look at the image on the screen. Timber that doesn't fit in a car. Plenty of times when I first started working with wood and creating projects, I would go to the shop, I'd buy the piece of timber that I need, I'd get to the car and realize it doesn't fit. Then you have to take it back inside, get it refunded and get 2 smaller pieces and redo all your calculations. It's a little bit confusing, a little bit annoying. So think about it at the beginning. I've added a new column in my table there when I've done my calculations to put the closest length. This is standard lengths. Now, timber comes in all sorts of lengths, and you can get it cut to size, but there are some fairly standard lengths that they work with in Australia. The smallest length that they usually sell at the shops is 900 millimeters or 0.9 meters. And then it goes up by 0.3 of a meter for each size. So there's a 0.9, a 1.2, a 1.5, a 1.8, 2.1, 2.4, 2.7, 3, 3.3, 3.6, etc. Now that's how the sizes go up roughly. The problem is they're not always super specific. So you might order a 1.2 meter piece of timber And again, these are nominal lengths, so they might be slightly shorter and you don't want to risk it. So I could order one piece that's 2.1 meters long, and that would get all my doors. And I could order one piece that's 1.2 meter longs, and that would get the smaller parts of the doors, and then I'd be fine. Or I could order one single bit of timber that's 3.6 meters long and get all the pieces that I need out of it. 3.6 meters doesn't fit in my car, so I'll be going with order option A. It might end up being a little bit more expensive, or it might make the order a little bit more pieces of timber that I need to order. But in terms of picking up in my car, it's definitely the way that I'd do it. If I had a truck, I'd probably go with option B. And I've listed there 3.6 is the nearest length. 3.3 is not a very common size. While it is a size that exists, it's risky because you've got to cut your timber. So if you don't have enough cutting space for the blade, you'll end up missing out. So I've just gone that slight bit bigger at 3.6 so that I definitely have enough space there to get my project created. So that's the process that I follow for ordering timber. Now I'll run you through a recap. We start with the common sizes. We prepare the cutting list. We do this by exploding our drawings and listing the items, the materials, and the quantities first. Once that's sorted, we go to our orthogonal drawings and get the dimensions for length, width, and thickness, and we enter those into our table. That's our cutting list sorted. The second aspect of the video then talks about how we order timber by grouping together like dimensions, running some calculations in terms of total lengths needed, and trying to work out what's the most economical and efficient way to get the timber from the shop to your house. So I hope that's been helpful for you. I look forward to seeing your ordering lists and your cutting lists in your folios. The last aspect that I'll point out is when you're ordering your timber, you see how I've got it listed on the screen. That's how I'd write it in an email. But if I was talking it on the phone, I would say, I need one piece, okay, read the first line with me, one piece of 42 by 19 millimeter pine that's 2.1 meters long. Okay, so you read it out like that. The one is the quantity / the dimension, then it's the timber species, then it's the length. Okay, so that's how we do it via a phone call or via email. Good luck with your cutting lists, and let me know if you need any help.